Kingsley Davis was born in 1908 and died in 1997, living through almost all of the 20th century. He was the first sociologist ever elected to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and was one of the most influential population scholars of the century. A cantankerous libertarian by disposition, it would be hard to find someone more different from V. Gordon Childe in political outlook. This article from 1955, the same year as Gideon Sjoberg's article on the pre-industrial city, is important because Davis presents one of the clearest explanations for the limited size of pre-industrial cities. He also spells out the difference between urbanization and simple urban population growth, which does not produce any actual urbanization if rural population grows just as fast as cities. Despite differences among these mid-century scholars, the similarity of their theoretical frameworks is striking. Each of these articles supports and reinforces the others. Together, they've shaped our contemporary outlook on the origins of urban life. Kingsley Davis also was my own mentor and dissertation advisor at Berkeley. Kingsley Davis published his article about urbanization in the same issue of the American Journal of Sociology, the fourth issue of volume 60, published in 1955, with Gideon Sjoberg's article that we already examined. In fact, Sjoberg's article appeared on the pages immediately following Davis's article in the journal, since it was a special issue about urban sociology. Unlike Sjoberg, Davis immediately cites the previously published work of V. Gordon Childe on the first page of his article. He clearly approves of Childe's description of the end of the Neolithic period and the role of technology, particularly including irrigation, in starting the urban revolution. He also adopts Childe's hallmark feature of true cities, highlighting the presence of full-time, non-agricultural specialists as the key test of whether a place was a village or a city. But as a sociologist, Davis is not satisfied with a one-dimensional explanation of the first cities as the result of merely technological inventions like the plow or irrigation or the wheel. These new tools and techniques were necessary for cities, he says, but by themselves they are not a sufficient explanation. As he often did, Davis here steps back and looks at the logic of the whole situation and raises a logical objection. Just making agriculture more efficient could have several different outcomes. Better farming tools and techniques mean more food, but as Davis puts it on his page 430, quote, "Instead of producing for town dwellers, the cultivators can, theoretically at least, multiply on the land until they end up producing just enough to sustain themselves." Unquote. By itself, more food could just result in more Neolithic villagers in more villages. A completely different kind of invention is needed for the rise of cities. Again, as a sociologist, Davis zeroes in on this other quite different invention in his very next sentence. Quote, "The rise of towns and cities therefore required a form of social organization in which certain strata could appropriate for themselves part of the produce grown by the cultivators. Such strata, religious and governing officials, traders, and artisans, could live in towns." Unquote. Davis knows that new forms of social organization are just as much an invention as any technological advance such as the wheel or the plow. There are two very important key words in this sentence. The first is the word appropriate, and here Davis is agreeing with both Childe and Sjoberg that the earliest cities were places where the new urban elite managed to create an effective claim on food produced by other people in the rural farm population. Effective both in terms of having an underlying religious or ideological justification and in terms of having the available coercive physical power to enforce the claim and take the food. Only in this way could people spend their lives doing other things so long as somebody else was producing all of their food for them. The second word is strata. And with this one small word, Davis manages to sum up all the descriptions from the previous two articles about a steeply unequal hierarchy of social position, occupation, legal rights, and other life chances, locked into place down through the generations by particularistic inheritance of status within rigidly stratified families. He even identifies the same groups of priests, warriors, and craftsmen the usual suspects in the urban revolution. As if to emphasize the exploitive character of this original urban protection racket, Davis even points out that once many of these ancient cities got such an urban civilization well built up and organized, they tended to stagnate and go along for centuries apparently content with what they had created. He notes that further advances, and eventually the Industrial Revolution, never happened in the same places where these first ancient cities had appeared. He suggests that the excessive power of these ancient urban elites gave them a vested interest in the status quo and discouraged them from further advances in civilization. Davis expands on this point about the long-term stagnation of pre-industrial cities and their civilizations by contrasting their lack of progress with the transformation of urban life that eventually took place when we crossed the great divide between pre-industrial and industrial cities. At the end of the section of his article that he called Subsequent City Development, he raises an issue that has bothered many scholars of urban life. Why didn't the Industrial Revolution start in Mesopotamia, or India, or Egypt, or Greece, or Rome? Why didn't it begin 1,000 years ago instead of barely 100 years ago? As these long-term pre-industrial civilizations drifted along, century after century, this Industrial Revolution that is so important to all three of our authors for this week suddenly broke out in a completely unexpected part of the world, where hunters and gatherers had barely managed to settle down into Neolithic villages. Quote, "In Western Europe, starting at the 0 point, the development of cities not only reached the stage that the ancient world had achieved, but kept going after that. It kept going on the basis of improvements in agriculture and transport, the opening of new lands and trade routes, and above all, the rise in productive activity, first in highly organized handicraft and eventually in a revolutionary new form of production, the factory run by machinery and fossil fuel. The transformation thus achieved in the 19th century was the true urban revolution." Unquote. So we see that while Davis added a distinctly social dimension to the purely technological explanation of the shift from Neolithic villages to ancient cities, when he gets to the shift from pre-industrial to industrial cities, he somehow falls back on a purely technological explanation again. Davis assembled and analyzed population data from around the world, including figures about the size and distribution of cities far back into history, as far as he could find reliable data. Some of his most well-known publications derived their impact from the new perspectives he was able to open up because he had put together facts and figures that other scholars have never managed to assemble and study. In his article on urbanization, Davis brings us past the dividing line of the Industrial Revolution and into the actual transformation of the world from rural agricultural societies to urban industrial ones. This is why he includes the word urbanization in the title of the article. Compared to the thousands of years of Neolithic prehistory discussed by Child or Sjoberg, Davis has to admit that even he couldn't find reliable data on the actual size and distribution of cities back before about 1800, only a century or two before now. But neither Child nor Sjoberg actually had any reliable population figures at all. Their descriptions were based on guesses made from studying the ruins of ancient buildings and hints found in writing on the walls of pyramids and buried stone tablets. Fortunately for Davis, getting back to 1800 proved to be good enough. Even at that late date, virtually every society on Earth remained a pre-industrial society. Virtually all cities were still pre-industrial cities. The last stage, what Davis calls the true urban revolution, is only a couple of centuries old, as he points out in the opening sentences of his article. Before 1800 or so, no society ever had more than about 1/10 of its total population living in cities, since it took about 10 farmers to support each urban resident. For example, at the American Revolution in 1776, every city in the English colonies was still a pre-industrial city. over 90% of the U.S. population counted in the first 1790 census lived in rural locations. Suddenly, with industrialization, all that changed, and the process of urbanization at last got started in earnest. In the central section of his article, called The World Trend from 1800 to 1950, clarifies what he means by the word urbanization. This clarification also explains why he thinks of the start of industrial cities and societies as the true urban revolution. Since urbanization simply means an increase in the proportion of the population that lives in towns and cities, Davis faces the problem of choosing a precise dividing line to define which people are classified as rural and which are urban. Actually, this is a constant problem for scholars trying to study cities in world perspective, because even today, different countries continue to define differently what they mean by an urban place. Davis attempts to solve this persistent problem by ignoring the official designations of urban versus rural places assigned by governments, and instead consider the reported population of any particular city. He compares two different boundaries for the urban proportion in this article. First, the proportion of people living in cities with at least 20,000 or more people, and then a more restrictive definition using the proportion of people living in cities with at least 100,000 people. In this way, he can measure the same boundary line in every country wherever he can find demographic evidence. Once he has decided exactly how to measure urban, Davis can add up his statistics and demonstrate that only about 2% of the world's population counted as urban in 1800, using either the 20,000 or 100,000 boundary lines. Even by 1900, shortly before Davis himself was born, and well after the Industrial Revolution was in full swing in some parts of the world, less than 10% of the world's population lived in cities of 20,000 or more. His evidence really brings home just how new the urbanization of our planet really is. This somewhat surprising result is based on 2 points that Davis brings out once he has shown us the basic facts and figures. First, since urbanization measures the balance between urban and rural populations, more large cities can be matched by what Davis called cultivators multiplying on the land, or rural population growth. If the number of large cities doubles, but the rural population also doubles, there may be no urbanization at all. The Industrial Revolution affected efficiency of agricultural production as well as urban manufacturing. Bigger and bigger harvests meant cheaper food in larger amounts. Progress in health and medicine combined with a reliable food supply to lower death rates, and rural populations began to grow with unprecedented speed. This new rural population increase matched the growth of industrial cities at first, so that even though industrial populations were growing fast in total, not much actual urbanization happened for some time. Only later, when rural population increase could no longer keep up with economic growth, did cities begin to grow faster than the rural population. Partly, as Davis points out, faster urban growth is fueled by migration from the countryside, as well as by urban natural increase. Davis links this migration, on his page 434, not only to expansion of non-agricultural jobs in the cities, but to the economic changes in the rural areas that went along with industrialization, including both labor-saving technology and declining birth rates. Quote, "As farming becomes increasingly mechanized and rationalized, fewer people are needed on the land. On average, the more industrialized the country, the lower its rural density." Unquote. In other research published later, he went on to show that in country after country, at about the point when half the total population is urban, the pull of city jobs to get people migrating from rural areas becomes greater than the power of the rural population to replace themselves by having more children. At that point, absolute size of the rural population begins actually to decline. While I was a graduate student studying with Kingsley Davis, I had a chance to do some research for the country of the Netherlands and was able to add that country to his list of places where total rural population started to shrink just after the country crossed the 50% urban point. The Industrial Revolution began to transform economic production in human societies. The urbanization process also began to gather momentum. We have seen that Davis counted 2.5% of the world's people in places of 20,000 or more in 1800. That increased to close to 5% by 1850, nearly 10% by 1900, and slightly over 20% by 1950. The percent of people living in urban places just about doubled every 50 years. This sort of repeated doubling is also known as exponential increase. In any such pattern, the actual changes begin slowly at first and then increase faster and faster later on. As already noted in the previous part of the lecture, Davis's Table 1 shows that even by 1900, less than 10% of all people on Earth lived in cities with at least 20,000 people. Even at the start of the 20th century, then, the world still fit the description of pre-industrial societies proposed by all three of this week's writers. We also just saw that Davis attributed this slow start for urbanization partly to rapid growth of rural population caused by falling death rates. The other reason he gives for the slow start for urbanization of the world as a whole is that the Industrial Revolution, and so urbanization, got started first only in northwestern Europe. His Table 2 shows that as of 1950, Europe and North America were twice as urbanized, over 40%, as the world average, while Asia and Africa were far less urbanized than the average. Even into the early decades of the 20th century, the Industrial Revolution itself had not really spread to many parts of the world, so naturally urbanization made no headway in these regions either. The world average concealed the uneven progress of industrialization and urbanization. Since the decade of the 1950s, when Davis published these findings, the urbanization process has continued pretty much as he described it. His observation that the global percent urban was doubling every 50 years remained true a half a century after he wrote it. By 2000, over 40% of the people on Earth were living in cities, twice the share that he observed at mid-century. A plot of urbanization for major world regions and countries shows North America and Europe far ahead of other regions in 1950, just as Davis said. Over the next 5 decades, urbanization continued in these regions, but again, as Davis pointed out, once most people already live in cities and the population available to move there becomes very small, urbanization simply must slow down. This is called a ceiling effect, because the line on the graph is limited by the upper boundary or ceiling and can go no higher. South America provides the most interesting feature in this figure, racing from only 40% urban in 1950 to become the most urbanized region at 84% by 2010. In contrast, China, India, and sub-Saharan Africa remained less than half urban through 2010, although China urbanized very rapidly in the last 3 decades. Even with the increased urbanization observed at the end of the century, these regions were still only at about the level of urbanization found in Latin America back in 1950 or even earlier. On his page 433, Davis links these regional and national trends directly to the process of industrialization. Quote, "Urbanization has tended to reach its highest point wherever economic productivity has been greatest, that is, where the economy is industrialized and rationalized." Unquote. However, Davis speculates later in his article that the areas starting late on this process of urbanization eventually would catch up to Europe and the Americas as industrialization spreads around the world, replacing particularism with universalism and family connections with merit and achievement. The last section of his paper goes off into all kinds of speculation about what the world might be like if the entire planet lived mostly in cities and our food came from industrial manufacturing processes rather than being grown in the countryside? Despite such interesting ideas about things like hydroponics and synthetic food, the 50 years since his article appeared have not really produced the convergence he expected in urbanization. The urbanization curves shown in the figure based on United Nations data reveal a gap of over 30 percentage points between Europe and sub-Saharan Africa in 1950, but this gap was still over 30 percentage points wide by 2010. Africa has not been catching up. Similarly, the urban percentage gap between North America and India was over 40 percentage points in 1950, and the two regions remained more than 40 percentage points apart in 2010. India also was not catching up. A major reason for this slow urbanization has been continued rapid population growth in rural areas. In both Africa and India in particular, industrial economies have grown rapidly and hundreds of millions of people have moved into cities, but continued high birth rates and rapid population growth in the countryside keeps the percent urban from increasing at the rate observed, for example, in Latin America during this period. When China's birth rate finally declined late in the century, their urbanization process began to accelerate. The contrast between rapid growth of third world cities but slow urbanization for these countries as a whole appears most clearly when we look at things from a different angle. We can ignore the rapidly growing rural populations that slow down the urban percentage and look only at the size of the cities themselves. In 1950, half of the top 10 largest cities in the world, including 4 of the 5 largest cities, appeared in North America and Europe, where urbanization began. Only 1 of the top 10 was in South America, and none appeared in Africa. By 2010, New York was the only North American city left in the top 10, and Europe had disappeared from the list completely. Asia controlled 6 of the top 10 spots, 2 were in Latin America, and Lagos, Nigeria appeared on the list from Africa. Even more striking, the largest city in 1950 was smaller than the 10th largest city by 2010. Only the continued growth of rural populations in Asia and Africa obscured the fact that the weight of urban populations has shifted dramatically away from the original centers of urbanization in Europe and North America. Kingsley Davis's predictions about convergence of all world regions on an industrialized, urbanized future may not have come true yet, but he gives us a clear definition of precisely what urbanization means as a process. He links this process to the Industrial Revolution, both over time in the last couple of centuries and across different regions of the world. From hunters and gatherers who wandered the earth for uncounted ages, we have passed through millennia of Neolithic villages and centuries of pre-industrial cities to arrive at our current urbanized societies. Most of our entire population now lives in urban places.